Well, good morning. I'm Lieutenant General Perry Wiggins, and I'm the Army North Commander. We're the Army Service Component Command and the Joint Force Land Component Command for U.S. Northern Command that resides at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. It's a distinct pleasure to be here, and it's even more of an honor to be a part of this esteemed panel that we have assembled here today. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you to being here in attendance, both physically and for the first time in my career, virtually, which I'm sure will be an adventure as the questions come from both of those areas. But, you know, hopefully you're here for enhancing North American security missions at home for them. If not, the doors have already been sealed and you won't be allowed to exit. Okay? But our moderator for today's forum is Vice Admiral Harvey E. Johnson, United States Coast Guard retired and also the Deputy Administrator and Chief Planning Officer for FEMA retired. And I can tell you that his credibility and credentials lend him to be ideally suited to lead this esteemed forum. And sir, it's a pleasure to have you here as well to moderate our forum. We're equally fortunate to have with us an esteemed panel members. And they're subject matter experts in the National Response Framework and the whole of government response. And we also have represented our three components of our United States Army. And I will tell you, it is absolutely humbling to be sitting in that particular chair today with this particular panel. So any questions you might have in today's forum will be well served here, getting the answers from these individuals that are represented. I'd like to take a moment, if you don't mind, to let each one of the panel members introduce themselves. And so at this time, if we could start with General Talley.
Well, good morning. We have a small but hearty group this morning. Hopefully some of your colleagues will join us and fill up this room. I'm the Chief of the Army Reserve and the Commanding General of the Army Reserve Command.
Hua.
Good morning. My name is Mike Fisher. I'm the Chief of the United States Border Patrol. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Good morning. Kathy Lanier, Chief of the Metropolitan Police Department, Washington, D.C.
I'm Damon Penn. I'm the Assistant Administrator for National Continuity Programs at FEMA.
I'm Bear McConnell. I'm a retired senior citizen.
Yeah, don't let Bear fool you. Bear's got about more experience in his pinky than I've got in my whole body. So, but defending the homeland and our very way of life is our #1 mission. The American people deserve, and justifiably so, expect that we're going to get it right the first time, every time, here in the homeland. The Army and Department of Defense is a small part of the solution. It's really a whole-of-government solution, as you see represented by the panel here today is a small part of that whole of government. But in 99% of the cases, the Department of Defense will be supporting another principal federal agency in the response. And that's important to understand and the difference of operating here in the homeland. In the homeland, the strength of our nation resides in our ability to respond at all levels, local, state, and federal. And it's that synergy that creates the solution to the things in the homeland that challenge us in addressing our threats. You must never be late to need here in the homeland. And our combative commander, General Jacoby, says that over and over and over again. So we must always remember that the American people have high expectations here in the homeland, and it's up to us to deliver, and that we only get one chance to get it right. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the microphone over to the moderator, Admiral, please, and he's going to set the scene for today's panel and forum. Thank you.
Good morning. The objective this morning is of our panel is to enhance all of your understandings, both those who are here and those who are tuned in online, about how this interagency panel works together in National Response Framework as our guide to integrate our capabilities and provide for the safety and security of our country. Our scenario today is a 10 KT improved nuclear device detonation. It's a ground burst with no warning during the morning rush hour in a major metropolitan area. The blast will decimate the area, in the immediate area of the blast. It'll cause infrastructure damage from a half mile to 3 miles away. First, second, and third degree burns from a half mile to 1 mile, and an EMP blast out to 3 miles. There'll be as many as 17,000 facilities within the half-mile region of the detonation, and 30,000 casualties out to 3/4 of a mile. be a high level of contamination out to 12 miles, and more than 3,000 square miles around this city area will be affected by the radiation. There'll be 1 million plus people that will self-evacuate into the population, and they will not have access to dosimeters and no access to any radiation meters, and most will not have a clue about evacuation plans and procedures. The initial response by local authorities will be severely hindered by the inability of first responders to operate in the contaminated area, gridlock on all traffic and transportation modes, and the effects of EMP on command and control communication systems. The capabilities of local jurisdiction will be insufficient and very quickly overwhelmed. It may take as many as 24 to 48 hours just to get a complete picture of the situation awareness and a common operating picture. In a series of cascading effects, all downwind transportation would be dramatically impacted. The local health care system will be stressed to the breaking point, and the immediate protective action decisions, very tough decisions about life and death and who will survive and who will not, will be very critical for life saving. And you'll need contamination control for medical intervention and actions like that to take care of health effects. I've just described what can be called a very big disaster, certainly a complex catastrophe, one that just by its very nature reflects the ability of the state and local forces, capability, capacity to be quickly overwhelmed. There is a need in such circumstances for a federal response, not just any response, but one that is flexible, scalable, and adaptable, one that aligns the key roles and responsibilities across all jurisdictions, one that links all levels of government, private sector, NGOs, all in a unified approach to disaster response and recovery, one that is always in effect, and one that will coordinate the federal assistance without any need for any formal announcement. In Hurricane Katrina, which is a landmark for a major complex catastrophe, we didn't have a guide for how we would respond in a coordinated way, and how well did that work out for us. But with the benefits of lessons learned, an awful lot of discussion among hundreds of state and local stakeholders, senior participants across all of our federal government, we now have such a guide, and it's called the National Response Framework. This framework tells us how we respond as a nation to major disasters. This framework will guide our discussion of scenarios today, and it'll guide the real-world response to any kind of a catastrophe that might strike our country in the near future. The framework defines the principles, the roles, and the structures that organize the way we respond as a nation. It identifies special circumstances where the federal government exercises a larger role, and including instances where the federal interests are involved and those that are catastrophic, where the state would require just a significant level of support. And the framework also talks about 5 key principles of response doctrine. Engage partnerships where leaders, before the event occurs, know each other, involved in active communications, develop shared goals and objectives, and how they integrate their forces. A tiered response, one that can operate from small events to major events by scaling up the approach the federal government would take to respond. Scalable, flexible, and adaptable operational capabilities to meet the requirements. And unity of effort through a unified command, one that provides clear understanding of the roles and responsibilities of each participating organization. And a readiness to act, but one that's guided by recognition of risk. And for those of us in this room, all of us who are operators, the framework establishes and describes the Joint Field Office, the JFO, which is the primary federal incident management field structure. It's led by a unified operations group, and that's comprised of senior leaders, that both the Defense Coordinating Officer, the Federal Coordinating Officer, a State Coordinating Officer, and other senior officials is assigned. So it's with that backdrop, we come back to a 10 KT explosion. We talk in context of the National Response Framework, that will come back and we'll begin our discussion with the panel today. Our first question will go to Mr. Damon Penn. And Damon, under the NRF, how would FEMA initiate a federal response?
Well, first I highlight one thing you said about the National Response Framework, Admiral Johnson. It is all hazard guide, and it does cover the government participation, the private sector, the non-government organizations, emergency managers, but the 2013 version also includes responsibilities for individuals. So all of those together then form the National Response Framework. And the first thing that it says is that the President is a lead for the response. The Secretary of DHS then coordinates the response and is responsible for the overall architecture. And then the FEMA administrator becomes the federal manager for the federal response and the advisor to the President and the coordinator. So the first thing that would happen would be standing up the National Response Coordination Center. And that is an organization that it consists of about 140 people when normally stood up. Of that, there are 24 departments and agencies that are normally represented. Industry is represented there, and also NGOs are all represented. And that's the place where we really manage the federal part of the disaster operation, and that becomes the heart of what we do. It's got really 4 baseline priorities that are part of what we'd initially do from the NRF. That is the initial assessment. Strangely enough, that's probably the most difficult thing to do. Even with a disaster of this size and magnitude, what works and what doesn't work becomes critical as you try to set priorities to figure out what you need to bring online first and where you need to divert resources. It also serves as a managing function for the emergency support functions, the 15 ESFs that are involved. Integrates national reporting requirements so we all have an understanding of what the situation is, and then links operations centers and subject matter experts together. And that's kind of the basis for what the NRCC does.
Thank you, Damon. Let's go to Chief Lanier. Chief, from the local perspective, can you tell us about the role of local law enforcement, and how would you establish command and control post-incident?
Well, unfortunately, we have a lot of experience in big incidents occurring, large incidents occurring in the district. The reality is, in a situation like this, is that I'm going to lose a significant portion of my on-duty force, but still have to establish perimeters and try and facilitate getting the other resources in. So initially it will be very much like what we saw at the Navy Yard incident just a few weeks ago, is there are multiple law enforcement agencies within Washington, D.C. So immediately we would, probably with the loss of communications, very difficult to give citywide instruction to multiple agencies without communications. But most of our responders here are familiar with the secure and evacuation plans, so they are to immediately go to the plan to start assisting with self-evacuation. That's going to be critical because any resources coming in, if there's gridlock, we're not going to be able to get in. So immediately going into securing that those traffic posts, trying to facilitate getting evacuation out and getting resources in. But command and control would probably very quickly be established in a unified command with local police, fire, and even our federal law enforcement agencies right here in the National Capital Region, just to get those priorities started.
For Lieutenant General Ingram, how does the Adjutant General support the Governor in an emergency of such as a 10 KT explosion? And how would you see the Guard units integrating into the larger state response effort?
Well, thanks for the question. Typically and always, the Guard is always subordinate to the lead state or federal agency. In this case, the National Guard would come in as all emergencies are local. The Guard's never in charge. We're always in support. Domestic response is obviously built from the bottom up. The Governor has a responsibility to support the state emergency management team, and likewise the Guard supports the Governor. Currently 19 of our tags are dual-headed in their states as directors of emergency management, and 12 of these are actually triple-headed since they're also directors of Homeland Security in their states. So the tag works very closely with the Governor. Again, because we're forward deployed in over 2,600 communities, we can get there very quickly and are essentially self-sustaining. The local connections really make a lot of difference as well, because the Guard has worked with the local sheriff, the fire department, the police department. The county administrators know who we are. We don't exchange business cards at the disaster. Typically, these people know each other. In many cases, in this particular case, with a 10 KT explosion, the guard would probably stay at a standoff distance and assist in evacuation. A lot of self-evacuees are going to be coming out of this thing. They'll work very closely with state emergency management to set up shelters and decon sites.
Okay.
Over.
So can I go back and just to add to a little bit to that response? Initially, when this incident first kicks off, the local fire department is going to be lead agency in terms of, who's in charge. I think everybody in the region here, through our training and exercising and our local plans, recognizes that, because right now the priority is going to be to save what lives you can save. We would be in support, but it would be a unified command. So the Guard would integrate right into that unified command, because typically the Guard integrates into our, force protection, security, perimeter security. We do have some ability to do decon and other assists with the fire department because of the capabilities. The need is going to be so large here, but the Guard would integrate right into the unified command. But the lead agency at the initial start of this would be the local fire emergency medical.
And in this case, Chief, you'd have perhaps a couple states, both Virginia and Maryland, as well as the district. Can you talk a little bit about how the Guard and how you would work across those borders and those seams?
Yeah, we're, again, fortunate, I think, or unfortunate, I should say, that we've had some experience with very large scale incidents, most of which were pre-planned. So we had, for example, the 2009 inauguration, where we really had to coordinate across the entire region for unprecedented crowds. And largely, again, traffic management was the key to getting people in and out safely, with 2 million people coming into the city. So we did work with the Guard across all 3 states and integrated through state police, which are the primary highway patrol teams, and through our crowd management desk, central crowd management function that we created inside of the Unified Command. So the Guard integrated very well across with the state. We put them into the state police working group, and so they integrated very well across the region.
This particular scenario, the states and locals would largely be inundated, overtaxed immediately, and there would be a call for federal support. From Mayor McConnell, who's in charge in the homeland, and what would Northcom's role be in such a major catastrophe?
I'm supposed to say thank you for that question, Admiral. Anyway, I'm still a little puzzled why I'm here, frankly. Let me tell you who I'm not. I'm not a representative of the Northern Command. I am not an employee of the federal government. I notice looking down this table, I'm the only unemployed member of this panel. So, but not being a Fed, I suppose, allows me a little flexibility in how I speak. What I used to be, and I guess that's germane, is looking after, what I used to do is look after what is the largest interagency presence at any combatant command in the U.S. Formation. At Northcom, where I used to work, I want to emphasize that, we had on any given day about 40 agencies with full-time representation in the headquarters, federal agencies almost exclusively. If you drew the circle around Denver, which, by the way, is the second largest concentration of federal agencies, not people, agencies, in the U.S., second only to our nation's capital, we had about 60 agencies represented in that circle. And when I say represented, I'm talking about people who had ID cards to get in the building, that had been briefed, that had sipped the Kool-Aid. These were people we knew, not just people that you'd find in the information pages. And I'm proud of that in the sense that the reason it was the largest is because it's the homeland that we were concerned about. And the best measure of some of that is all but about 3 of those agencies I talked about were there on their own nickel. Border Patrol in particular, as a matter of fact. So Good deal, good setup, good arrangement, good indication of the focus of what we're really here talking about is how do you work together? How do you build trust? And I've heard trust about 50 times at this conference in the last couple of days, and that is the key. Also at Northcom, 40 full-time guardsmen, 40-some full-time guardsmen, to include the deputy commander, and the law says either the commander or the deputy will be of the reserve component. 20, last time I counted, coasties were there. And these folks would bring the Title X community some understanding that Title X didn't have, some capabilities. The Guard and the Coast Guard, the National Guard and the Coast Guard, know things about law enforcement that Title X knows nothing about, and can do with certain authorities things that Title X cannot do. So that's an important context about why there is a Northern Command and how that Northern Command works. You know, there was, say, a Northcom deputy commander that, you know, subsequently made good as the chief of the National Guard Bureau, for example. Who's in charge? That's a tricky question. When you talk about 10 KT, we can't even figure out the right term to describe such an event. There's debate about that. OSD likes complex catastrophes. FEMA likes, hey, that's really big.
Well, we're simple people.
Okay. But who's in charge is tricky, and maybe there's not really a preset answer when you're talking about a new debt. And the reason that maybe there's not a preset answer is the document that governs what we do. It's called the Constitution. Makes it clear that the limits on the federal establishment are broad, and the powers of the state establishment are wide. I mean, that's the document that persuades you that mayors do not work for governors and governors do not work for the president. That was a foreign concept to me at one point, but it is very true. It's a federal system. So, who's in charge? Northcom. Northcom mission has three components. Defend the homeland. Well, every combatant command has that. It's a common mission. It's a mission we sort of understand. Are there any Brits in the room? The Brits haven't invaded Baltimore lately, so you have to sort of think about what homeland defense means in a conventional military arrangement or arena. The second component is security cooperation. Security cooperation, Northcom has security cooperation responsibilities for Canada, Mexico, and the Bahamas. You say, well, that's not very many. Well, tell you what, no other command has responsibilities for security cooperation with our neighbors. And we say, well, Canada, they're just like us. No, they're not. Yeah, we have a mature relationship with Canada, particularly through the NORAD side, but Canadians are Canadians. They're not gringos. Mexico, that's an interesting thing too. We used to be mill to mill with Mexico was tough, really tough. Not that it's easy now, but at least now, little anecdote, Katrina, some of us remember Katrina. Some of us remember the Mexican army marching into San Antonio and feeding a bunch of people who were displaced from the events on the Gulf. In my humble opinion, that marked a shift in our mill-to-mill relationship with Mexico. And the leadership at Northcom has worked that very, very hard. And it is better than it was. Probably there's room for further improvement. And of course, the new administration in Mexico causes us to revisit a lot of things there. Okay, so that's two legs of this thing. The third part of the Northcom mission is this monster called Defense Support to Civil Authorities. And that defines, it seems to me, the role of Northcom in a 10KT event. The S word, support. Uniformed people don't like to support others. They like to have assets, they like to have a mission, and they like everybody to sort of step aside and let them accomplish that mission. So, kind of tough to have this support word looming over our head. We work on it all the time, or excuse me, those people at Northcom work on that all the time. It's better than it was. It could be better still, it seems to me. Speaking of Katrina, and I guess this is an example about who's in charge, and then Damon, of course, and Admiral Johnson remembers this. During Katrina, there was a certain period of disarray in the who's in charge question. And my then boss, Admiral Tim Keating, was assigned the task of being a wind dummy. I think some of you are familiar with wind dummies. And publicly was given the opportunity to speak to the possibility of DOD being in charge in a major event in the homeland. I think the final number was about 42 governors quickly made it clear to him that he had not read his talking points correctly and that DOD would not be in charge in the homeland. Remember that?
I do.
Sir. The Katrina, 50,000 National Guardsmen, 20,000 Title X guys. The Coast Guard performed superbly. Thank you, Admiral Johnson. But when you think about it, Katrina's small compared to a 10 KT. We don't really know much about that. But we can say that mass care would be overwhelmed, search and rescue would be overwhelmed, decontamination, mortuary affairs, you name it. And God help us if that 10 KT happened, Chief, in your town. We've got not one governor, but 3 governors, 4 governors actually, and no governor in D.C. So figuring out who is in charge is a little tough. In theory, Department of Homeland Security would manage the crisis. Department of Justice would look for the terrorists that did this thing, and the Department of Energy would do the radiological evaluation of the event. And that's just the federal who's in charge. I don't think we really know, frankly, who would be in charge in this event. Thank you.
Thank you, Bear, for a great response. Here it is, we have a lot of people who don't quite know who are in charge at the top end of the organizations, but where Chief Lanier sits, there's immediate response staring them in the face, and they need support. Lieutenant General Wiggins, this puts you square in the gray area that Bear has just described and made even broader. So can you tell me from your perspective, how would you respond, how would you prepare your forces, and how would you operate in this gray area where it's not quite sure who's in charge, but we sure do want you to come visit and bring all your forces with you?
Well, I can tell you right up front, in about 99.9% of the cases, I'm not in charge. So I only got 0.1% of the opportunity to really screw it up. But, you know, the bottom line is, as the Joint Force Land Component Commander, one of the things that initially happens is really getting situational awareness. When you think about the magnitude of this particular event, Fukushima, for example, in Japan can probably be about as close as you could get. First thing that we're going to do is try to find out the current situation in the impacted area. And by the way, we have federal forces that are engaged, getting accountability for those folks that are here in the capital region on leave and visiting family members, and those sort of things is important. And then from a force protection perspective as well, because we have critical infrastructure that we're responsible for. We got to get out, make sure we protect. And so we still have mission requirements that we have to perform. And similar to what the chief said, you know, you have people that are affected. We have folks that are unaccounted for. You have people that are injured within our formation. And there's responsibilities to the commanders, some of them sitting in this room, that have a moral obligation to those families and to those folks that fall within their command. And that's important. So there's a human dimension to this thing that's hard to replicate in any exercises that we have as you get after it. And it's something we also faced in Katrina, where you ran into local first responders in the fire and the police and National Guard who had family members that were directly involved with the incident at hand. And so to conduct your mission And to separate that from the emotional side of this process, to me, was probably one of the most impressive things I have ever seen or witnessed. We tend to operate 9,000 miles away. Our family normally sits at home. Sometimes we can't communicate. It's getting better. Desert Storm, it took me about 4 months. Recently, my sons over there can communicate every day by Tango. So, our formations are 1,000 miles away, but their families are normally taken care of. In this particular case, it's in the homeland. It's catastrophic, or whatever word you want to use, big. The bottom line is it's horrific, and it's the American people. It's in our backyard. So one of the things I'm responsible for is setting the theater. And as you take a look at probably the max exodus that's coming out of the area that the Admiral described, that restricts your lines of communication. And so we have to designate and work with several agencies to get ingress into the affected area. Now, in the homeland here, we have a formation that's a chemical and biological response enterprise. It consists of General Grass's folks on the Title 32 side and federal formations on the Title 10 side. They're very capable. They train. We do an exercise called VR that takes place, has in the past several up at Muscatatuck and Atterbury, Indiana. It cannot adequately replicate the situation, but we try to do as best we can to train the technical support formations that reside within those elements, both in our CSTs, a 22-man team that normally belongs to the governor and responds to white powder events at the steps of the Capitol and other pieces that go unnoticed and unregistered and really unreported, to our HERF elements and SURF-P elements on the National Guard side. But on the Title 10 side of the house, we have the Defense Suburban Response Force, which is a Title 10 formation that within 24 hours responds to the incident site. I will tell you what was an epiphany to me is, it highlights the fact of how many agencies are out there. When we did our first VR exercise, I was standing there and a group of guys showed up and I didn't know who they were, and I asked, I said, "Who are you?" He said, "We're the guys charged with gathering evidence." And I said, "Evidence?" I said, "Where do you get the evidence?" "Well, we go to the point of the explosion and we pull the stuff up and try to get a signature on the detonation of the device. We work with local law enforcement agencies. We get in, we get it, and we get out." And I'd been involved with this particular mission for about 2 years and had no idea they even existed. But they're out there, and now we work hand in hand. But that's the complexity of this particular piece as you take a look at it, because you got to remember, this is a criminal act that took place as well. So there are some things that goes on that you got to make sure you protect so we can get after the folks that prosecuted this particular piece as well. But my particular job is to make sure that we get the architecture set both logistically, signal-wise, because as you heard the chief say as well, cell phone towers are down, communications restricted, and some of those things that we habitually used have been affected by the blast and some of the pulse created by the blast. So how do we get the communication back into the hand of the first responders and those folks? And Northcom does a great job and has great capacity and capability to be able to do that. But that's part of our mission. When we get to the affected site, our Suburban Response Enterprise is designed to search and rescue and then provide decontamination and medical support to those individuals and get them pushed back to the groups, non-governmental organizations that normally respond. But you got to realize this, when you have a hurricane, normally you don't have a lack of people volunteering to support. There's the Southern Baptist Chainsaw Brigade, the people that want to feed everybody. There's a lot of organizations out there, and you have to orchestrate. And by the way, that's part of the chief's, opportunity to try to orchestrate that too, because it creates problems. But I think in a nuclear blast, and I'm only assuming here it's the belly button, it's an opinion, people aren't going to be rushing to the sound of the drums. We've got the decontamination issues. We got people who are impacted and affected and probably fatally sick that don't even know it. And they can affect other people. And by the way, we didn't get there quick enough, and they squeaked out through other pieces and parts and have contaminated other areas that weren't even in the affected area. So that's part of the situational awareness that we try to take a look at, and that's part of the problem and the complexity of this particular piece that as a JFLIC we got to keep in mind. And as we send our formations in, to include first responders, there's a thing called a dosimeter that we apply to them. And by the way, guys like me and guys like the chief here and the National Guard all will set dose parameters. And once a soldier or a policeman or a fireman reaches that particular piece, they're no longer able to enter the affected area. They're used, and that's for a lifetime. A lifetime. So this is a different environment, and if you don't understand the complexities of it, you got to make sure you educate the folks. So that goes to the JRSOI, the staging and onward integration of formations to support those folks in the affected area, and that's part of the mission of the JFLIC as well. That includes a blood test normally. It includes an examination of the folks and an education of the folks that are in the affected area. Because psychologically, it's going to be impact is going to be overwhelming. Now, we have a defense coordinating officer, as you heard was mentioned. That person is appointed, and once he's activated, works for the Secretary of Defense. And that's the person we'll get initial situational awareness from. So he works for the NORTHCOM commander and the Secretary of Defense at the point of incident. He's normally integrated into the FEMA team there that's on the ground and works hand in hand with the federal coordinating officer. He works within the Unified Coordination Group to establish the requirements and establish missions assignments for follow-on forces. And I will tell you, the follow-on forces will be huge. When you think about Fukushima, the Japanese employed over 120,000 soldiers to the affected area. And that's where the guy to my right will come in pretty heavily, both of them, as their formations will be charged to come in and respond. And therefore, it's a significant logistical requirement and a huge transportation requirement and all those things that we do in theater, but the added complexity of having the protective overgarments in order to protect our formation as they go in, and then the days of supply for that, and the expense associated with that is tremendous. So that's what the Joint Force Land Component Commander would be doing, looking out for the federal formations. We'll be supporting our federal partners and some of the unique capabilities that we have. We've been supplying those to support their missions and their requirements so that they can get after their mission at hand of saving lives in this particular piece and taking care of the American people. But thank you.
Thanks for setting the stage for the type of forces that would be required and what capabilities exist. Let me go to Lieutenant General Talley. And can you tell me what capabilities are there within the Army Reserve, and how would you provide those to this type of an event?
The Army Reserve has the majority of the combat support and service support for the total Army. So I think that's where some of the analogies were drawn earlier. So we have to be able to provide that support immediately to the nation. So how do we do that? Well, in this particular type of scenario, we have 2,300 soldiers that are trained specifically for submarine response and are part of a federal submarine response team under Title 10. And they provide technical support forces that have been trained and are ready to be used immediately for decontamination, detection, search and rescue in the contaminated area of the incident, and to rescue citizens and remove them to civilian or military hospitals for care. We provide the aviation and medical transportation capabilities to transport survivors to appropriate care facilities. And we're linked to Army North and NORTHCOM in a variety of ways. First and foremost, we have the 76th Response Command, commanded by Major General Dan York, where that command is distributed. They own the majority of our chemical, they own half of the chemical units for the Army Reserve, but they also own all the EPLOs, the Emergency Preparedness Liaison Officers. The Army Reserve provides all of the EPLOs for the DOD, and those are embedded in FEMA. And that's their full-time job. That's what they do. They work in FEMA representing DOD, but they're by the Army Reserve. And they're linked back to the United States Army Reserve Command. The U.S. Army Reserve Command has staff and forces embedded in Army North all the time to provide an immediate response, and we also have forces and staff embedded at NORTHCOM to make sure that coordination is there. So we would immediately respond. Our EPLOs, and we see this every time we have any emergency, the EPLOs are launched on active duty normally in advance, but if it's a sudden event, they're immediately put on orders because I'm the commanding general of the Army Reserve Command, and I don't need anyone's permission to order Army Reserve soldiers to active duty globally. I can do that on my own authority. And so the standing order I have as the CG is we put them on active duty orders immediately. They respond. They start off on an annual training basis up to 29 days, and then they may transition in terms of continued active duty under 12304 Alpha. That's exactly what we saw during Sandy. Our FEMA coordinators, and we also have a lot of DCOs, they're linking back to make sure that we're supporting Army North and General Jacoby at NORTHCOM. And we're also using our facilities that are located across the United States. As a community-based force like our brothers and sisters in the National Guard, we're located pretty much everywhere, but we specifically have 1,100 communities and about 6,500 buildings and 1,000 reserve centers that are across all of your major cities and areas, and we have 4 Army installations that we manage. And so what we can do is, during a high demand, we can provide support in terms of any kind of emergency: medical, transportation, aviation, water supply, PLL distribution, engineers, generating support facilities, case of Sandy, dewatering capabilities, because again, we own most of that capability for the total Army. And the standing order that I've had out to the field is that we don't want to get hung up or tripped up on permissions. At the end of the day, the American people deserve to have an immediate response from anybody that will provide help. And so, as the commanding general, the guidance I have to the field is, if something occurs, don't wait for guidance. Bring your folks in, put them on orders under the commanding general, U.S. Army Reserve Command, and provide support to anybody that needs it. It may be the local National Guard unit that's now in charge of what's occurring in that state, or in a strong support role for that state. My point is, we don't want to sit and wait for the authority to come down. I have the authority to put them on active duty immediately and to do whatever they feel they need to do to support anybody that's responding to the crisis. We saw this work very well during Sandy. The Army Reserve provides that capability, and in partnership with the National Guard, we're ready to support NORTHCOM. Thanks.
Thank you for outlining the specialized forces and the full capability of the Army Reserve. Let me come back to Lieutenant General Ingram. Sometimes when we think about how a TAG supports the governor, in this case, there's at least 3 or 4 governors involved, and the National Guard system really is a system overall, with the various states having various capabilities that are all called upon in time of disaster. Can you talk for a couple minutes from a National Guard perspective? How would you reach beyond, how would a TAG reach beyond their state and their local capabilities in the Guard to bring the full capability of the Guard forces?
Well, there are several ways that that'll happen. First, a 10KT is a bit of an anomaly. That's a whole different situation. But in a typical domestic response situation, if it's multi-state and a state's capability is stretched, they'll go to the emergency, an EMAC agreement, Emergency Management Compact, that all the states are part of, and the territories for that matter. And they'll request and receive whatever capability they need from a neighboring state. Again, it's an Emergency Management Compact. The Guard's only a part of that. There are many other state agencies that are part of an EMAC agreement. So you can get, if you need additional law enforcement, you can get a sheriff's department from another state to send deputies in. If you need military capability, it can come from the Army National Guard or Air National Guard for that matter. It just builds on the capability. NORTHCOM plays in. We have very recently it has been established, and it's really quite well established after especially Sandy and the Colorado floods, a dual status commander that is trained at NORTHCOM, so that a single individual can have command and control over both National Guard Title 32 and federal Title 10 forces of any component or of any service. So it's a one-person point of contact, and again, that dual status commander works for both the governor and for the CG NORTHCOM or Secretary of Defense if you carry the chain up. The National Guard has significant capability in types of units and in soldiers. Jeff mentioned aviation, but there's usually aviation in most disasters is the most sought after commodity, and there are aviation task forces that we actually build it in the J3 at National Guard Bureau to be available when they're called upon. And usually it works through an EMAC agreement first. If the need escalates to the federal level, then you get other forces that come in.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have a 10 KT scenario here that occurs in a major metropolitan area. The fact of the matter is something like this could occur at any of our ports of entry around the nation. Let me come to Chief Fisher and ask you to talk a little bit about the Border Patrol and your capability to respond to such an event that might occur.
Thank you, Admiral. First, I'm going to break this down into three different components. First and foremost, in the event it's in the National Capital Region. As the Chief had mentioned, it kind of changes things from our standpoint because our command and control for the United States Border Patrol and broadly within U.S. Customs and Border Protection, our command is here in the National Capital Region. Second, I'll talk generally if it's outside the National Capital Region, where we would most likely plug in within the National Response Framework. And third, what we would do as an affirmative duty without direction from higher. First, let's start with our continuity of operations. So our COOP plan in the event of a National Capital Region. Automatically, the authorities that I would have as the Chief of the United States Border Patrol, and certainly my counterparts in the other two operational components within CBP, would automatically be moved forward. So that would include the authorities that I have delegated down from the Secretary of Homeland Security for steady state operations, through my deputy and my command staff. We have 3 locations in priority, primary, secondary, and tertiary locations, which would be identified, automatic protocols, and they would have to continue the mission, making the assumption that given the catastrophe as described, illicit networks would want to continue to exploit and probably would exploit as we're trying to recover and respond to a disaster of that sort. So we would have to maintain our at and between the port of entry mission and making sure that we're able to do that. So immediately COOP activations and that protocol would go into place. Outside the National Capital Region, within the National Response Framework, primarily U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the United States Border Patrol in particular has in the past and presumably would respond in 2 primary ways. First and foremost, under the essential support function, I think it's number 9, which is the urban response, search and rescue response. We have capability, approximately 430 Border Patrol agents that are trained, both our BORSTAR, which is the Border Search, Trauma, and Rescue, and we also have Border Patrol tactical units who train and operate and have deployed in similar missions. We would send, includes K-9 teams and others, to help the local responders to be able to do that urban search and rescue mission. We would get that request through FEMA. That requirement would come through, that would be tasked out, and the teams would then deploy within 24 hours. The other area within the ESF is our primary public safety and security mission. This would be, Border Patrol agents would be assigned to things like force protection, perimeter security, anywhere that after an event, natural disaster for instance, or even the example that we're using, there would be a requirement at some point after the event for public safety and security. Sometimes that may last for days. In a case like this, it may last for months, depending upon damage assessments and capabilities and the local law enforcement, either at the local or state level, to be able to maintain steady state operations. And we would be on call to be able to do that. We have in the past, and presumably given this scenario, would be deputized either through the U.S. Marshals to broaden our current statutory authority under our DHS authority, to be able to make arrests and do the things that generally the local and state authorities would be able to do. Third, and I think equally important to us in terms of what we would affirmatively do, is immediately start targeting and doing risk segmentation for individuals associated with those illicit networks who perpetrated this. As the General mentioned, this would at some point in time either the FBI or under the direction of the Attorney General, Secretary of Homeland Security, be able to try to piece together, and those first critical hours and days are going to be very important for us to do that. We would do very much what our legacy component did in U.S. Customs, and our ability to very quickly identify the 19 hijackers on September 11th, utilize, and by the way, those capabilities are a lot more robust than they were back then, to be able to identify individuals and recreate travel patterns throughout the world to be able to narrow down the scope of potentials. They would also be able to stand up immediately a protective net, if you will, and be able to do risk segmentation and targeting in terms of individuals that are either flying into or over the United States airspace, as well as coordinating directly to either shut ports of entry down as part of that containment and or stand up southbound operations in the event individuals or illicit actors are trying to move north into Canada or south into Mexico. So those are some of those. The other broad capability, and I'll end with this, Admiral, is, which is generally on every occasion this request comes in to USCBP. That is our air capability. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has the largest civilian air force in the world. That's not, I'm not bragging about that, that's just the reality. And in many cases, to include light observation helicopters, medium lift capability, and 10 unmanned aerial systems, the Predator Bs with EOIR, thermal sensing, and radar capability to provide that situational awareness. We have pre-existing certificates of authorization with the FAA to fly Predator Bs in U.S. airspace. Those are pre-designated. It gives us berth to be able to patrol the areas that we need to. In the case of this emergency and on a few other occasions in the past, we have been able to expedite and get emergency clearance for those certificates of authorization for our UASs to fly over airspace and provide persistent surveillance for whatever period of time that the mission requires for us to be able to pipe and live feed into whichever command center needs that level of information. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. What a complex event. Whether you use big or complex, it's a catastrophe. We've talked about practiced integrated response. We've talked about local integration of forces, unified command. The NRF talks about local events, sometimes local events, high probability, low consequence events, and we operate those every single day. We've seen Chief and Air do that here in the last couple of weeks with those types of events. And then it talks about those large events that are low probability but high consequence. We've heard almost all of our panel members talk about the capabilities that exist at the federal level, and various parts of the Department of Defense are available to bring into forces and to support those local requirements. We've talked about preparedness and people who operate without direction. We've talked about designated mission clearances. And then we also understand the environment that we work in, where there's a political overlay that focuses on who's in charge, and yet the force that shows up, as Lieutenant General Talley says, it takes guidance without command, takes guidance and operates as they need to be. So fortunately in our country, if we have an event such as this, we have people who've thought about in advance the impact, as Lieutenant General Wiggins talked about, in terms of education, limitations of the dose, contamination, those kinds of things that most of us don't think about every single day. All of this takes preparedness. So let's talk for a couple of minutes about how we prepare for an event, expecting that it won't happen. And let me just give the audience a heads up. In about 15 minutes, we'll open it for questions. So both for you and for those who may be calling in. So if you would, think about the kind of questions you might want to ask, and the panel will spend about 45 minutes in response to your question. Let me come back and start another round here and start with Damon Penn. Can you tell me, as the Assistant Administrator for Continuity, how has the government enhanced security through preparedness for such events?
Well, excuse me, Chief Fisher hit on part of it, and that's the individual continuity of operations plans for each department and agency. But I would take that a step further and tell you that the continuity responsibility goes down to all levels, including our non-governmental entities, including individual citizens. So when you think of continuity, I ask you not just to think about a place and where you go to do what you normally do, but you really have to focus on being able to determine what essential functions are and being able to do those essential functions under all conditions. So in a scenario like this, heaven forbid something should happen to Chief Lanier, she has a deputy, and the deputy would step forward and do the duties that she normally performs. But what happens when you get 4 or 5 levels below that? Who then knows that they have the authority and is given the authority and is able to execute the mission as directed? So that's really more of what continuity is about. Sometimes we get so wrapped up with where we're going to go and what we're going to do, we forget about what we're supposed to do after we get there. So you have to start with essential functions and work your way back. And you have to come to the realization that you're not going to be able to do everything. There is not a second Pentagon someplace where everybody's going to go and perform all the missions of DOD. But there are places and there are arrangements for the essential functions to be done. And then once you establish what those essential functions are, and you do that, and you've got the leadership reestablished, and you move forward from there, then how does that evolve over time, and how do you change what's essential, and how do you change your direction, and how do you modify what your priorities are as you continue to work through the event? Because we often focus on what happens on day one. We've got all our essential functions. We know what we're going to do. Then we go and have lunch, and then we come back, and then we talk a little more about it, and then we declare victory, and the exercise is over. But what happens in 3 weeks? And I'll give you an example. The way the executive branch of government is organized is there are 8 national essential functions. Those are 8 things the President said that we are going to do. Of those 8 essential functions, and there are 113 primary essential functions that the departments and agencies have to be able to perform. And that's how the government's organized, the executive branch is organized, and that's kind of how we come to flow. For example, one of the primary mission essential functions is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, establishing that all of the nuclear power plants are safe and we have all that we need to do to continue to operate. And that's a great essential function. But that, I would contend that on week 2 or 3, maybe not so much, because we're going to know, and that part of our disaster is going to be stabilized. But come week 2, month 2, year 2, some of our essential functions are going to change. So Department of Education, as an example, does not have a primary mission essential function, nor should they, because if we have a 10 KT scenario like we're talking about, we're not going to be that interested in schools during the first couple of weeks. First couple of months, couple of years, we're going to want to get the kids back to school because we want to get the parents back to work, and that becomes the more difficult part. And that is kind of continuity 201. So then once you establish, how do you continue to get back to some sense of normalcy, and how do you reestablish and continue to modify and work on what your priorities are?
Thank you, Damon. For Chief Lanier, if there is such a yardstick that goes from high probability, low consequence events to low probability, high consequence events, you already operate on the upper end of that scale on a routine basis. But can you talk for a couple of minutes, what types of actions do you think can effectively be taken to improve large-scale incident integration?
I think a couple of the most complicated issues have been raised here. One is, 2 governors and a mayor in terms of immediate decisions, and then the impact of that long term. We assume everything in our training and our planning, our policies, our exercise, everything that can impact Washington, D.C. in terms of big or catastrophic event is going to impact the region. That's just an assumption we make on a regular basis. We have had scenarios with the Guard where we've had, in pre-planned scenarios, pre-declaration of emergency, where the 2 governors and the mayor were all involved in that pre-declaration. So I think there is a little bit of a blueprint for us to help get through some of those complicated issues. But the other big issue really is the long term and the road out. We do plan, train, exercise. We have, a lot of capabilities in terms of our own dosimeters, protective equipment, ability to decon for a day, maybe 2. And we know the feds are coming, but our job until the feds bring that support is to not have any additional loss of life until that support gets to us. And that's going to take some time. We're fortunate here in the National Capital Region that DOE and a lot of our federal partners are involved in joint terrorism task forces and national capital response squads. I think one of the only places in the country where we have locals and federals, to include DOE in this circumstance, that respond to threats in the national capital region every day. So those working relationships will help, but the short-term capability is very short-term for us. So that support that we're going to need for timeout is going to be critical in how quickly we can get it here in the national capital region.
One of the points, Lieutenant General Wiggins, that you made earlier is the American public's expectations are very high. Chief Lanier points out very aptly that local forces can provide support for themselves for a certain length of time, and it's that gap between the expiration of local capability and the actual arrival of their federal forces. Can you talk for a couple of minutes about what actions can be taken to refine and improve that level of cooperation, the speed of a delivery of forces?
Well, you know, one of the things that we do is we pre-position stockage levels, and we concentrate on key terrain. At the combative commander, General Jacoby, has identified places within the continental United States that he considers key. And with that, we pre-position those formations, that equipment, and put them on a response timeline where they can get there fairly rapidly. And we also work with Transcom to work really the transportation requirements for those formations to make sure that that's already preloaded, that when the trigger is pulled, we can get them out either in a self-deployment configuration, or we can load them onto Air Force platforms, or self-deploy, which, as you heard, with a lot of the aviation formations here in the homeland. But you know, it really, what's important is training and the exercises. And I can tell you that you know, for me, the past 12 years of persistent conflict, concentrating on the Middle East, I'd probably break my neck trying to don my mask in 9 seconds. And that used to be a requirement for us. And those of you in uniform or who used to serve in uniform know how important that was to be able to put your mop suit on, be able to do your chemical protective overgarment, the rubber gloves, the boots. And for our aviators, I'll tell you, it was a significant emotional event when they found out they had to wear all that stuff during the exercise. And that the control touch kind of goes away a little bit when you're wearing the rubber booties and you got the mask on. Things get more complex. It takes longer time to do those sort of things. And that's stuff that takes practice. That's stuff that takes rehearsing. And so we rehearse it. We try to replicate it, as I stated earlier. And we work hand in hand with our local and state partners and our National Guard partners in reserve to make sure that it's seamless as we can get it. And I will tell you, what rules the day is relationships in this environment. So, you know, the more relationships you can build, the more face-to-face interaction, the more coordination you can do ahead of the incident is critical. And that's why, in a time of constrained resource environments, the biggest concern I have as the commander of USR North is reducing those exercises. Because to me, it's that repetitive nature and being able to work side by side in an exercise formation that's going to prepare us for that zero failure mission that we pray does not happen. But if it does, we better be prepared to perform, and the expectations are high, and we're going to be able to do our mission. And I guarantee you, you can have something going on in Syria, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, but if something happens in the homeland, you're not going to read about it on the news channels. The Boston Marathon is a perfect example. You'd have to shift through about 15 news channels or Google and go onto a website to find out any news about what was going on in Afghanistan during that particular event. Because the American people have an expectation that we're going to take care of the homeland, and that's our #1 mission. And so, to me, it's important. The exercises are important, and that's how we get to flash to bang, mitigate the gap, is working with our state and local partners to make sure we're prepared and that we fill the gap with those capabilities, as you heard the chief say, like decontamination, and that we're prepared to do that because we know they've only got a limited time and a capability, and we've got to get in there and fill that gap, and then we pull ourselves out once they're capable again and remand that over to our state and local partners so that they can complete the mission in support of their citizens, and it's important.
You know, if you think about it, one of my primary goals immediately following an incident like this, besides the immediate, preservation of life and supporting all those other things that I talked about, is I have to commit a significant amount of resource on making sure that I can get those assets in that I need. So I need landing zones established. I need major emergency routes open and get people in and out. People don't think about something as simple as How do you, everybody says, okay, well, the federal response is coming, but in the chaos, in the self-evacuation, and I'll talk about self-dispatch too, which I think would be another issue that I had not even thought about with in the homeland with military folks like we have with law enforcement folks. But, you know, if that's not something that's taken into consideration immediately, our federal partners won't be able to get in to help us. So we have to, you know, secure and establish those landing zones, secure and establish those emergency routes in and out, because the resources can't get in, they're not going to be able to help us. And then again, the self-dispatch issue, I think, to your point, very well put, that you're not going to have as many people self-dispatching when you're talking about radiation that you would if you had a storm. But I've seen it on every single large-scale incident involving law enforcement. I think the military would be no different. You raise the issue. This is not over in Afghanistan. This is not in Iran. And those who have families that are living here in the homeland that are active duty military and a lot of reserves are going to want to self-dispatch to help. And how do you manage and coordinate that self-dispatch? We actually saw some of that at the Navy Yard for the first time. So I think these are things that are new components we really need to figure into, because that self-dispatch is a help, but it also needs to be coordinated or it can get in your way.
We're a nation with a short memory. Hurricane Katrina was a while ago. And whether you're a citizen or an elected official, it seems like people respond and prepare for what they think is going to happen tomorrow, not what might happen at some other later point. Lieutenant General Talley talked about a lot of specialized capabilities we've never used in our country. What challenges do you see in terms of maintaining force structure, force capability, and force training, given the tough budget environment, and yet the forces that you would respond to in a contaminated area? For Lieutenant General Talley.
You were looking at Bill? I thought Bill was going to answer for me. Thank you for the question. One of the challenges that I'm having is right now, of course, our total Army is downsizing in terms of in-strength and force structure as we try to realize required cost savings that we must meet in order to reduce the size and the spending within the DoD to help address our fiscal responsibilities or fiscal challenges to the nation. So when the first thing we started looking at, we the Army looked at that, they said, Jeff, you've got a very large amount of specialized units that deal with chemical activity. We don't see that you deployed a lot of those in Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, just about all the Army Reserve deployed steadily over and over and over again, but we didn't use a lot of that chemical regimen. So maybe that's an indicator to some of the Pentagon staff that maybe you can get rid of those capabilities. Lucky for me, the Commandant for the Chemical School for the U.S. Army and others jumped in and said, you know what, we need those for the homeland. We need those to provide federal special capabilities to the homeland, because they are well trained and very well equipped. And even though they weren't, thank God, needed in Iraq and so far in Afghanistan, we may need them for the homeland. So one of the challenges that I think I've been able to be successful at is to articulate that we must keep those in our formations, especially when the cost of keeping in-strength and force structure and reserve component is relatively inexpensive and provides a tremendous insurance policy to the unknowns that we have in the future. To our specialized forces that we have that are equipped and trained in this area, often they're also equipped with off-the-shelf technology to support their military equipment that mirrors or links with those of the first responders. And so, like everybody else at this table and their organizations, either organizations they were part of in the past or currently part of, we participate in all of those exercises. In order to increase the Army Reserve's DISCA capabilities and support to Army North and NORTHCOM, we're increasing our presence at Army North and at NORTHCOM. And those assets are being paid for by me out of the Army Reserve, because I think we must be better integrated with Army North and NORTHCOM in order to basically do what America expects us to do. And at the end of the day, the Army Reserve just needs to be there, as I said earlier, to meet the needs of the nation. And I have the authority to make that happen initially, but then, thank God, through the National Defense Act of 2012, we can then bring our reserve forces into a federalized status, our federal forces into a mobilization status to assist with complex catastrophes under that special provision, which worked well under Sandy, at least from my perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. For Lieutenant General Ingram, with the budget cuts that occur both at the federal level and the state level, how is the National Guard being affected, and how might that affect you in terms of Chief Lanier's point of how quickly can you respond? Will you be limited at all by what you see coming in the next couple of years?
Well, I think one of the primary missions of the National Guard is defense of the homeland in concert with the governors. And, you know, we're doing the same thing that Jeff is doing. With budgets diminishing, obviously, we're prioritizing what we keep and what we don't. And the training, honestly, the training for our combat formations really pays off in the homeland. We use the same formations in the warfight generally that we do in domestic response. And I'm often asked, you know, why do you need tanks and Bradleys? Why do the governors need tanks and Bradleys for homeland response? And it's not the tanks and Bradleys that we need, it's the organization. A brigade combat team that's organized in squads, platoons, companies, battalions, and the equipment that they have, the trucks, the radios, etc., and especially the organization, is very, very useful in the homeland. That's a fight-tonight capability that we have. You can call an infantry battalion to do a homeland mission, and the equipment they bring with them, and especially the leadership roles, squad leaders and platoon leaders, company commanders, and the communications network, and the established operating procedures that they have, allows that formation to be used literally the next day, or, you know, before the wind stops blowing in the case of a tornado, to assist the locals in doing cordon and search and doing checkpoints and isolating the area, etc., as well as providing medical help and other things that are needed. As time goes on, I think each Guard state has a COOP site for the headquarters, usually in concert with the State Emergency Operations Center. They move both, and there are JRSOI sites in each state that are already established if we need to have people come in to respond to an emergency in that state. Several JRSOI sites as well. The exercises that are done at the state level in concert with FEMA and NORTHCOM and others help prepare the National Guard to respond to almost any type of emergency. Specifically for the 10KT discussion that we're having here, the SURF-Ps and the HERFs are already trained, designated. They have the equipment on hand. They can assist greatly in doing the extraction and decontamination. They're built for that purpose. The CSTs, and there's one in every state, at least one in every state, several states have more than one, can detect and predict the plume for any type of contamination plume as the winds move it around. Help, and they're immediate. They're right there in the state. They respond in hours, not days. And there are other assets. The National Guard not only provides the Title 32 response, but also under NORTHCOM, if they're called to, they can be federalized and go into for a large event like the 10KT. Guard formations from anywhere in the country can be brought in, probably at the same timeline that federal forces can come in. So,
thank you.
Cool.
For Chief Fisher, you've just finished developing a strategic plan. You aren't left untouched by the budget pressures that we have. When you look to step outside what people think of a typical role of Border Patrol, how does your strategic plan accommodate supporting these large catastrophes and major disasters?
Well, I think initially, if you look at the three pillars, information, integration, and rapid response, I think what we would have been planning, and certainly as we develop this year's operational implementation plan, it fits quite nicely, I believe, in terms of being able to respond, whether it's through the mobile response teams or the other special units that I had mentioned before. So I think what it does is it pre-positions ourselves for our current border security operations to be able to very quickly develop a flexible workforce. Look for mobile capabilities as our steady state operations to then be able to move into areas depending upon what the requirements are. So I think the way that the team has built the implementation plan, the way that we think about our borders now is totally different than it was even 5 years ago in terms of trying to focus predominantly, since our 2004 strategy was really predicated on denying terrain, right? This whole strategic notion of deterrence and putting a Border Patrol agent every 50 meters and an integrated fixed tower behind those agents every 2 or 3 miles, and incrementally trying to do that across 2,000 miles to the south and 4,000 miles to the north. As we transitioned away from that, and it wasn't at the time because of budget considerations, although it does help us in the budget environment over these last few years, it didn't make sense in terms of continuing on, because what we were facing, both in terms of the environment in which we operate, had radically changed, at least in the short 26 years that I've been patrolling the border, to our capabilities, both in terms of frontline agents and organizational capabilities have changed quite dramatically since 2004 as well. And the third and really most important piece for us as we looked at this was really the convergence of illicit networks. And so we just couldn't continue to operate as we were in '04, and so it took a whole host of smart folks, not in a cube in the Ronald Reagan building, to be sure. We had reached out to many senior leaders within the military who had seen this in 2005 and 2006 and trying to figure out we can't continue to fight this the way that we used to. We needed that innovative thinking within an organization that, quite frankly, we're very proud of our traditions, and sometimes very slow to change, in which we look at the environment in which we operate and say, you know what, I may have 26 years in, but we can't continue to operate like I was trained. So the broad sense of having a flexible workforce, understanding first and foremost that information and then parenthetically intelligence is going to drive what we do every hour and every day at the tactical up and through the strategic level, and recognizing that the border and those illicit networks, as they continue to mature and exploit the legitimate infrastructure that binds this globalization that is occurring in front of us, is really important the way that we think about our ability and being a lot more nimble in anything that we need to respond to, either incursions that are happening right now, either at or between ports of entry, or certainly during the requirement to be able to stand up a force and move it and be able to plug in through some integration, whether it's through the National Response Framework, whether it's through steady state training at the local level, and understanding everybody's lanes in terms of authorities and how that operates. I think it's a mindset that the strategy has created, and certainly the implementation, that as we get stronger in the implementation, it further defines the leadership mindset that quite frankly wasn't there 10 years ago, and perhaps necessity still being the mother of all invention will give us the sense of progress as we move forward, both with and without catastrophic deployments.
Thank you, Chief. That's a great segue to sort of a concluding point. There's an expression that preparation equals performance. And I think if we go back to 2005 and Hurricane Katrina, we saw the performance because there wasn't a whole lot of preparation. We spent a good half hour of our session today talking about what is a 10KT event, how big is that event, and how ready are we to respond initially. What would we do if it occurred? And as we heard about, whether it's on Twitter or Google, we would know about it instantly. How can we respond now? And we spent the last 25 minutes talking about how are we really prepared. And as we look to the budget pressures in the future, how would we maintain our preparedness? And I think at least if we use the yardstick of 2005, before Katrina, before National Response Framework, we can get a good sense of the progress that's been made, both in the actual reality of capability and in the mindset of senior leaders and those who work for them, the readiness to respond despite the dangers that would be inherent in that response. Let me turn now for the next 40 minutes or so, 35 minutes, and ask if there's some questions from the audience, both those in the room and those who are listening online, that you'd like to offer to the panel. We've got 2 microphones here, microphones on the side, so please just approach a microphone and we'll call on you, and any panel member will be prepared to respond. If you'll identify yourself and ask the first question.
Stu Magnuson, National Defense Magazine. For Chief Fisher and Mr. Penn, can you talk about a little bit more in depth on the continuing resolutions, government shutdown, sequestration. How is that having an effect on your daily, what you do daily? I know your predecessor said keeping a nuclear bomb out of the United States was his #1 priority, but also can you maybe talk about what these 3 factors are doing and for your preparations for the next event too? Thanks.
I'll lead off. First of all, the funds that we use for disaster response are the disaster relief fund has not been affected. So there's still more than adequate funding for the next disaster and the next emergency. So I don't think you need to worry there. But like all other agencies, we have had to make some pretty tough decisions on what's important and what we could cut and which programs that we had to eliminate. And I think we've done a good job. The administrators have been very focused, again, on what is essential for us, what tasks that we have to perform, what tasks we would like to perform, and then what tasks that we can't. And then it's been very focused on making sure we didn't produce a hollow agency where you just do an across-the-board cut of 30% and all you have left is your salary and benefits, and you have people sitting around and they have no money to do their functions with. So I don't think we're in a bad spot. We never have everything that you want, but I think we've taken some very judicious measures to make sure that we can still perform the nation's mission.
Do you have some examples of things you can't have?
Well, within my responsibilities for continuity, and I'm responsible for the continuity of the executive branch, you always want more. You always want, if a second site is good, a third site must be better, a fourth is even better than that. If you have 2 radios, 3 radios is better, 4 radios is even better. So we've had to make some discussions there and have some decisions about what's enough and right size a few things, and that's kind of been the basis for within my responsibilities what we're really done. And as Chief Fisher mentioned earlier, one of the risks is that it's always difficult to provide funds for something that might happen when you got things that are happening that you can't fund. So a very delicate balance there, again, between what's enough and what you can actually live with.
I think from my standpoint, I grew up in an organization that was kind of, we always had infinite requirements and finite resources. And somewhere along the line of my career, I stopped whining about it and said, hey, you know what, that's just the way it's going to be. And quite frankly, if we didn't have challenges, whether it was sequestration or whether it was current budgets, one, it wouldn't be as fun, and two, I think everybody or anybody could do it. So what we've trained the workforce over the last few years is to recognize it's not just about stuff. And quite frankly, we probably wouldn't have gotten as far in our implementation if we still had very robust budgets where the dominant theme within the strategy, our previous strategy, was resource based. So if you needed to quote unquote control the border or do it, you had to ask for more stuff. We developed a leadership cadre that you pulled the string, and they needed more infrastructure. I need more fence, I need more border patrol agents, I need more technology. And until and unless you give me that stuff, don't expect anything. Now I'm saying a little bit of an exaggeration, but quite frankly, when we shifted into a risk-based approach, it now gives us the ability to start thinking about risk and risk mitigation and prioritizing what is more important than others than across the board giving everything what they want. And quite frankly, I don't think the team would have come up with Skyfall Initiative, which is our ability to use the unmanned aerial systems using radar and using EOIR to be able to do coherent change detection, to be able to shrink the border without deploying those resources at a cost to the government. So I think in many cases it gives us the ability to really force innovation in a different way of thinking. Nonetheless, it is challenging, but we're going to continue the mission. I'm not one of the when I go out and talk with the workforce, I'm not one of the guys that's going to stand up in front of the agents and say we're going to do more with less. What I'm going to tell them, we are going to accomplish our priority mission with what we have, regardless of what that is, and we will make those adjustments. And there's got to be a recognition that continued reductions in budgets, there will be reduction in capability. And I'm telling the field commanders that's not a bad thing to say, because you can't continue to say, well, we're not losing capability, but our budgets are being cut, 5, 8%. We are going to reduce capability. That's where the prioritization and leadership is going to come in.
Are you disappointed the integrated fixed towers aren't progressing quicker?
Yes,
Any word when that's going to progress?
very soon.
Thank you very much. Let's come, if you'd identify yourself and ask the second question.
My name is Chuck Rodriguez. I'm the former Adjutant General of Texas 0509. Thank you, Admiral. Thank you, panelists. Great presentation. One of the things that you mentioned, Admiral, was about the immediacy of the information. People will get on social networks. It'll be on the news. CNN will be there. And a lot of goodwill will come out from a lot of people, domestically, internationally. Barrett mentioned some of the support that we received from Mexico in Texas. There's going to be a lot of goodwill. How does the system work? How can information be shared with the public, domestically and internationally, about what is needed? Let's say this happened in the winter, in the dead of winter, and you got a whole metroplex that needs taken care of both psychologically and physically, but especially physically, in a blizzard. So how do we get the needs out there to our domestic audiences who want to help, and to our international partners who want to help? And then how does that get coordinated? How does that stay robust and alive? Because you can bet social networks will do it if we don't.
Damon, let me ask you to take the first crack at that. And Chief Lanier, you face this, and you just mentioned those that volunteer. Damon, give us a first crack, and Chief, if you could follow up.
Sure, and that's a great question. That is a lot of what the National Response Coordination Center does. Coordinates not only efforts of government but non-government, and the full range of options and capabilities that the nation has. Just a reminder, though, that it is all predicated on what the needs for the state and local leadership is. So for things like the example that you mentioned, the warm clothing and everything, that's not something that the federal government would push forward, but that's something that, if asked, then we can coordinate and put together and get arranged for to support the governor and his efforts. You'd really be amazed at the number of non-governmental organizations and private industry that come forward in a major disaster like this, that have capabilities that they would like to supply and help that they want to perform. And as Chief Lanier mentioned earlier, the more difficult part is managing those that show up to the fight and want to help versus trying to find somebody that has a capability and bringing them. Because some people you don't know are there until they show up and they're out of gas and hungry. And then you wind up with a larger logistics tail feeding the people that are supporting the disaster than you do feeding the people that were the survivors.
I think the biggest integration here, especially with the DoD component, is the National Response Framework and NIMS compliance requires that these things be accounted for and planned for in advance. So with the NIMS compliance component of implementing the National Response Framework, you're going to have a JIC, which is your Joint Information Group. This is the representatives from every agency involved, federal, local level, to make sure that messaging is going out, the appropriate messaging is going out. We actually use social media extensively to get our own message out and correct bad information. Both in Boston and at the Navy Yard, we saw bad information going out over social media that went viral with the press, and we had to correct it over social media, and that's what our JIC was tasked with doing. And it is, we picked up about 70,000 additional followers following the Navy Yard incident because of that, using that social media to our advantage to correct bad information. Also under the NIMS compliance, you're going to have logistics and liaison positions that are established immediately, and that's their job. Their job is to coordinate logistics, bringing in liaisons, a lot of private sector resources. And we had private sector resources that we were coordinating in the Navy Yard incident, which essentially was a 12-hour operational period. I mean, evidence collection went longer, but I mean the initial crisis of that operation lasted about 10 hours. We still brought in private sector partners to assist us, and that's the role of the logistics and liaison positions in NIMS compliance, which is written into the National Response Framework. So I think that's where that will all come in.
And Bear, one of your many roles when you were at Northcom was dealing in advance with a whole spectrum of NGOs. What are your thoughts about how to harness their capability and the information flow, and then the arrival of those who volunteer to assist?
You cannot harness an NGO. But nonetheless, you know, DHS has a public-private partnership outfit. FEMA has a public-private partnership outfit. Northcom has a small public-private partnership outfit, too. And it goes back to why we do interagency stuff anyway. You know, everybody likes the phrase, exchange your business cards before you need to exchange your business cards. We know relationships have been developed in the private sector. Relationships with the U.S. Chamber, relationships with business executives for national security, relationships with the American Red Cross, relationships with the faith-based community and stuff like that. So if we know each other before the event, chances are we're going to talk to each other during the event and to a degree be able to do what we're talking about. The self-motivated are going to show up. And they will just be there. That will be an issue, as Damon talks about. And even, you know, going back to the 10KT thing, sometimes the self-motivated won't show up. I mean, even under EMAC, Emergency Management Assistance Compact, we got to remember that's voluntary. And that means that the individual governor is going to go along with sending the resources that are requested. And whereas that in Katrina wasn't a problem, in hurricanes in general there's not a problem. You know, when we're talking about radiation, well, maybe that governor is a little reluctant to send his assets to an area where those assets will be quickly used up one way or the other in case there's a problem in his house. Pandemic is something we used to talk about a lot, not so much as we used to, but would you send, would an NGO go to this place? Would a governor send a fire, urban search and rescue outfit to this place if in fact those guys would come back perhaps infected to his own area? But it's trust. You know, we keep saying the word trust. If we know each other and we understand each other and we're talking to each other, chances are we'll figure it out.
Great, thank you. Please identify yourself and ask the third question.
Grant Tabor, American Innovations. With improvised explosive devices, the weapon of choice of terrorists spanning decades, and homemade explosives being utilized as the main charge in most IEDs today, if it's not a UXO, and the HME precursors being one of two, nitrates or chlorates, which have been spanning domestic IED attacks back to 93 World Trade Center bombing, 95 Oklahoma City bombing, 2013 Boston Marathon bombing. I'd like to know what each panel member's position is on equipping the men and women under your leadership with tools that can target these very specific precursors that are making up the majority of all the IEDs employed today. Thank you.
Chief, would you like to take the first crack at that answer?
It's an excellent question, and it was something that was a priority at the local level, you know, prior to 9/11, going back to Oklahoma City and making sure that we have the current capabilities for detection and prevention primarily. That's our primary job. Response is the last resort. That's what we don't want is response. I think post 9/11, a lot of people invested in response tools and technology, but prior to that, there was a lot of investment in prevention and detection, especially in explosion detection capabilities. I think across all the panel members, getting those tools in the hands of the right folks is important. At the local level, our capabilities has quadrupled in the past 10 years. Technology has been significantly, played a significant role, but there's still a lot of just human capability, training and things like that that you have to invest in that can't go away. And I really appreciate the comments about some of those specialized capabilities that we have cost a lot of money, and they're investments that we have to maintain. And when they don't get used often enough, they often become targets for cuts in budgets. But it's kind of like car insurance. You don't need it until you need it. So we have fought hard to maintain that we stay current and active with our capabilities at the local level.
Chief Fisher, for your forces?
Yeah, I would agree with Chief Lanier. I mean, one of the things that we look at is, let's say, for instance, precursors that are readily available in the United States. You know, to what extent do we want to go ahead and continue to train agents that are working in an environment at the border where generally that illicit commodity is not going to be smuggled? And so we would look at, do we want to train and have that capability throughout the 21,000 force, or is that something that we would need with our specialty teams that work outside of that environment, work very closely in many cases, not just in training but in deployments with local law enforcement to give them that capability. And again, it's those trade-offs that we've talked about. You know, one of the things that I've always said to the leadership, not just within the Border Patrol but within the department, is let's not say, hey, yeah, we want Border Patrol agents to do that too. And we did a few years ago when this whole notion about, chem bio. Well, all of a sudden, the tasker gets assigned to the Special Operations Detachment to have those guys do that as a collateral duty. You really, not that we're watching for mission creep, but you really have to figure out what you're getting into and recognize, one, are we adding value to the mission, and or two, are we duplicating effort? And we really want to make sure that we have that leadership discussion, because if we're going to take it on, we're going to be very proficient at it. And if we don't need to take it on, we don't need to, because it's the flavor of the year of all of a sudden there's these emerging threats, and all of a sudden they keep tagging the force to be more trained. And I mean, all of us probably had the same opportunity over the year to be carrying around 300 pounds of lightweight gear. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense to do that across the force.
From a Department of Defense perspective, we have the Joint Improvised Explosive Device Defeat Organization that works on state-of-the-art lessons learned, because, as you stated, it's been going on for a long time with IEDs, but the enemy's evolved. The Oklahoma bombing is not the same as what you see now in theater. And so as it starts and continually evolves, we have to make sure we have trained and ready formations to get after that. And that's what our explosive ordnance disposal teams do in our formations. And they maintain that state of the art. But what Chief Fisher and Chief Lanier both said are absolutely critical. You have to take a look and temper action with wisdom. You've got to make sure that you're preparing your force, but you're balancing that, because yes, it is the weapon of choice for our threats, specifically in theater, and that's what we do, and we expend a significant amount of capital and time, resources, and equipment to really get after that particular threat. But at the same time, you got to make sure that you put forth the equipment, the people with the expertise, the appropriate expertise, the detection piece, and there's a bunch of components with that. And we created an organization to help us stay at the leading edge of that, and that's the JIADO. So thanks.
As we go to our fourth question, let me just ask on the side if we have any questions that have come in from our online participants.
I'd just like to make a final comment. Our greatest assets are people. And all we need to do is essentially incorporate maybe 15, 20 minutes of program of instruction, POI, to create awareness. Less than 3 years ago, 85% of all the IEDs in Afghanistan was ammonium nitrate, calcium ammonium nitrate-based fertilizer, a slight variation from what we encountered in the Oklahoma City bombing. Today it's potassium chlorate. But bottom line is our people is our greatest asset. We just need to train them, make them alert, make them aware, so they can come home to their families after their duties or their shifts or whatnot. So, again, thank you for your time and for all you guys do up there.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you could identify yourself and ask the fourth question.
Sure. My name is Major Rich Sabo. I'm with Joint Force Headquarters, National Capital Region. Chief Lanier spoke about her biggest challenges being containment, evacuation. General Talley spoke about how he's got chemical units in his forces. General Wiggins, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to start with you. In light of these comments and in light of the conversations that we've been having here at the convention, what is your ideal composition for regionally aligned forces in our AOR? And based off of General Ingram and the National Guard having an essential 10 capabilities in the States, how would you see that unit or that set of units developing trust with those units that are already on the ground? Thank you.
Well, I can tell you that on behalf of General Jacoby, I'd like to have it all. So, the bottom line is that's not realistic with all the competing requirements that we have. But you know, we have a pretty responsive and capable force in our, you know, initially was called the C-SMRF, and we've advanced and come forward with the chemical, particularly the technical support capabilities that we need within the formation to respond to this particular type of incident. But, you know, the forces from NORTHCOM, and we're getting after those, are the enablers, the logistical support requirements necessary to set a theater, the signal requirements to set the communications architecture, not only to support the Department of Defense, but also to support our local and state responders as well. And that interoperability is key. So, you know, I will tell you, I think we're well on our way with military intelligence, combat service support formations, communications, signal capabilities, and then general support formations in the form of our brigade combat teams in some ways, engineering requirements as well that we need, and then medical that we need as well. Aviation plays a huge part in that. There's not enough aviation, but I'd also like to see aviation as a part of that formation, because in this type of particular event, I think getting to the incident site, as you heard mentioned, is going to be a big part of that fight. Because if you have all the capability in the world and you can't get it to the point of incident, then for me it's all for naught. And by the way, time is critical. As I said in my opening comments in the introduction, you cannot be late to need to get to the incident in the homeland. The expectations of the American people is too high. And people like Chief Lanier down there who are working, and Chief Fisher, who are at the point of the spear, you know, they expect, and we have to be there in time to support them, because time is of essence, especially when you're talking about operating within an infected site. So for me, those are the things I think, which by the way probably covers the preponderance of our Army, but to me is critical. And I think as you heard General Talley say, people need to start taking a look at least at these formations that have been there, prepared, capable of doing something. And it's not like insurance. It really is being prepared for what is our #1 mission, and that's protecting and defending our way of life here in the homeland. That's important. So I hope to answer your question.
And sir, for those forces that are designated, how would we go about training them? Because defense of the homeland is completely different from fighting the war overseas. There's a lot more intricacies involved in working with our interagency partners. How do we train those forces to develop that level of trust that the first responders share amongst each other? How do we get down to that level of trust with them?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. It really, of course, resources are going to have a part in that. But I can tell you, we mentioned Katrina several times here. Probably the scariest moment for the Imperial Division, the 82nd, was when a deputy sheriff there on the street corner was having problems with gangs and wanted to deputize all the guys in Maroon Berets with M4s and ACOGs. And our lieutenant platoon leader decided that was a good idea. That was up until his leadership got a hold of him and decided that wasn't necessarily a good idea. You know, the homeland, you can commit career genocide in the homeland in a nanosecond. So you have to know the laws. You have to know the principles of DISCA. You have to know how the interagency works, and you have to communicate with our partners. Some of that is inherent within our formations today. You don't have to teach it, train it, because it's there. We do it in our schoolhouses. We do it in our course of our daily actions in theater. It really talks about the nuances of those formations, what their capabilities are, what is the roles and missions here in the homeland. And really, the hardest thing is to convince guys in 12 years of persistent conflict who have been large in charge, name your place in Afghanistan and Iraq, that they're not large and in charge in the homeland. Matter of fact, you know, I'm probably the example of a guy that got kicked out of a state almost. General Grass remembers that. You know, the difference is there's sovereign countries here in the United States, you know, 54 states and territories. The governors take very seriously their sovereign rights. And so as a Department of Defense entity, a federal agency, when you operate, it's those relationships, it's that trust you talked about. And that's got to be left to that bank. If you don't do that up front, people are going to be very suspective of what you do. And that's the education I think our soldiers need. It's not necessarily how to do their business. It really is an education that here in the homeland, it's not business as usual. And you're not large and in charge.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Identify yourself and your question, please.
well, this happens all the time. I'm Graham Jenkins from the Institute for Defense Analysis, and thank you all for your expertise and your experience here. A couple years ago, FEMA and the National Labs put out a document called Key Response Planning Factors, which was really great even for the layman. Postulated a 10 kiloton IND at 16th and K, showed fallout patterns for the region, showed the effect of different types of dwellings, for example, a brick row house at 11th and Clifton, and at the time I lived at 13th and Harvard, so decided the best course of action was just to stock up on whiskey. But in terms of shelter in place and evacuation, there's obviously a lot of different guidelines, a lot of different steps depending on where you live, what kind of facility. And I guess what I was wondering is how do you promulgate those standards and that concept of shelter in place versus immediate evacuation? Because it's hard, I mean, without doing sort of a duck and cover regime, it's hard to get people to even take it seriously, much less have a plan. So that's sort of one question. And the second is, for something like that report, is it possible to tailor that to different cities? Is there a framework that exists for that kind of planning? Or was that sort of a one-off?
No,
well, first, I think whiskey is part of the official planning for shelter in place. Damon?
No, there is, and we have teams throughout FEMA located in the regions that do that for each major metropolitan area and for the 10 FEMA regions. You know, the biggest single component, and you mentioned this, when it comes to emergency response is the individual. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, the National Response Framework now includes the responsibilities of the individual. But the whole focus of what we like to call whole community is really how you tackle any disaster. It goes from changing something as simple as changing the title of the person affected from a victim to a survivor. Because victims wait for somebody to help survivors move forward and try to figure out what they need to do to get things done. It goes to things as simple as being able to provide wireless communication capability so an individual can call someone to have them come and help them leave the region versus waiting for an emergency manager or some other government official to execute an evacuation plan. All of those kinds of things all come together. But the real focus still has to be the individual and educating the individual on things like you just discussed, on where the shelter-in-place positions are in their particular building, because all federal buildings are required to have those, and then being able to communicate at the incident back to the individual. And one of the things that we've at FEMA brought online within the past 2 years or so is the wireless emergency alert system. And that's a tool that emergency managers have at all levels where they can send wireless messages over your cellular device. And that's helped a lot in being able to communicate initial messaging and give people the initial information that they need to get started. And then social media. Our boss is a big social media person. And you, as mentioned earlier, you get a lot of disinformation in social media, but you get a lot of information too. And I was really surprised when I was talking to survivors from two of the shooting events that we had at universities, that they spent a lot of time with social media when they were on shutdown, but they were able to distinguish between what was their friends sending information that they may or may not be able to collaborate versus the officials being able to communicate and giving them actual instructions. So I think all of that together is what it takes to solve the issue that you raised.
I think just, at the local level, I think that's the really important part of what the local preparedness should be doing in advance. And we do try and do that. We have emergency management agencies that go out to the communities and law enforcement, because typically more people will come to a community meeting than the police are, because we represent who got robbed today versus what you can do to protect yourself tomorrow. So we draw a bigger crowd, in other words. But I think in a crisis, people in the communities are looking for their local face to give them instruction. And, you know, it may come as a little bit of a surprise, but people are suspicious of the federal government, especially in major metropolitan areas, and they want to see. That's why that joint messaging is so important. They want to see a face of somebody they know that's in their community every day giving them instruction. And it's fine to have military and federal folks standing all along with them, but they want to hear that message from a person they know is in their neighborhood every day that they trust. And that's why that joint messaging is so important. So the prep work is on us. We can't rely on the federal government to go out and educate our citizens on what's the difference of radiological contamination and how you may take it back to your family versus you know, a pandemic exposure and those things. That's our job to do that in advance and make sure we have that messaging. But it's all of our roles to make sure that joint messaging at time of crisis goes out as one voice.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much. Lieutenant General Wiggins.
First and foremost, I think, you know, I was absolutely awed by the panel, but I think we did an exceptional job up here on the front row. I'm not including myself, but absolutely folks here. Please give them a round of applause for being a part of the panel. You know, if you didn't get a realization, hopefully you did, that we've come a long way in just a few years. There's a long way to go with regard to responding to a piece or an incident that you heard of this magnitude. But hopefully, one thing's for sure, it's not from a lack of trying, and the American people can stand proud that we got formations just like the folks you see up here standing ready to tackle probably, in my estimation and my opinion, one of the most horrific and challenging and complex events our nation could face. And yes, even though we do pray that this never happens, we've always got to be prepared for if and when it does happen to make sure we can respond. And if you just peel back the history, just a small part, and we mentioned some of it, Japan and Chernobyl, it doesn't necessarily take a threat. It can be, you know, Mother Nature out there or a mistake that can create a disaster that equals and really rivals those processes. And I will tell you, when I first came in this job, I was at the at the War College at Carlisle. I got contacted by a friend of mine when he found out I was coming to a position similar to this, and he said, Google Chernobyl. Just Google it. Take a look at the pictures. Google Earth pictures and take a look at the magnitude of equipment that is parked there and will be there for the next 100 years before the radiological effects will get down to a point where people can crawl on that equipment. Take a look and measure the amount of people that were infected by the radiological circumstances and how many people were affected and virtually were fatal but lived for many days beyond the event and the comforting that took place. And take a look at the first responders and take a look at the soldiers across the spectrum that responded that will be impacted for the rest of their lives as well. So I thank you very much for being here. Appreciate you participating because you did participate in the process. And have a great convention. Thank you very much.